They laughed first. That's the part nobody talks about. They stood in that parking lot in broad daylight, in front of God and everybody, and they laughed. I want you to think about something before I tell you this story. Think about the last time someone looked at you and decided, without asking a single question, that you were nothing, that you were less than, that the space you occupied wasn't worth their basic respect. Now imagine you had the power to prove them wrong. Completely. Permanently. That's exactly what happened to Winifred Hayes on a Tuesday afternoon in Clover Ridge, Georgia. And by the time it was over, not one person in that town would ever make the same mistake twice. Winifred was 57 years old, and she carried herself the way people carry things they've been holding for a long time, quietly, carefully, without complaint. She was a small woman, barely 5'3". With close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses, she kept on a beaded chain around her neck. She drove a 10-year-old Buick the color of charcoal, wore sensible shoes, and spent most Sunday mornings at Mount Calvary Baptist on Elm Street, where she'd sung in the choir for going on 20 years. To anyone who didn't know her, Winifred Hayes looked like exactly what she appeared to be. A retired schoolteacher living out her quiet years in a small southern town. That was the first mistake. The second mistake belonged to a man named Holt, Regional Vice President of Clover Ridge Properties, LLC, the company that had, over the past 3 years, quietly bought up nearly 40% of the residential land in Clover Ridge's historically black neighborhood, a stretch of streets the old-timers still called the Maple District. Boyd Holt was 44, drove a white Escalade with tinted windows, and had never once in his professional life been told no by someone who looked like Winifred Hayes. He was about to learn what that felt like. It started the way these things always start, not with a bang, but with a piece of paper. On a Wednesday morning in late September, Winifred came out to her front porch to get the mail and found a manila envelope tucked behind the screen door. No stamp, no return address, just her name printed on the front in block letters, Winifred C. Hayes. She set down her coffee cup, picked it up, opened it. Inside was a notice of property acquisition. 3 pages, dense with legal language, informing her that Clover Ridge Properties, LLC had exercised an option on the land beneath her home under a municipal redevelopment ordinance, and that she had 30 days to vacate. Winifred read it once. Then she read it again. Then she folded it neatly, put it back in the envelope, went inside, and called her neighbor, Bet Okafor, who lived 2 doors down. Bet, she said, when the line picked up. Did you get a letter this morning? A pause. Lord, Winnie? Yes, don't sign anything. Don't call the number on that paper. Don't open your door to anyone you don't know. What are we going to do? Winifred looked out her kitchen window at the yard she had tended for 22 years. The dogwood her late husband Arthur had planted the spring before he passed, the rose bed along the fence, the stone path she'd laid herself, one weekend at a time, while her daughter Tamara was in middle school. We're going to handle it, she said. Just give me a day. The community meeting was held that Friday night at Mount Calvary, in the fellowship hall, and 43 people showed up, which was every adult resident on the 6 blocks that Clover Ridge Properties had targeted. Most of them were older. Several were widowed. A few were on fixed incomes. All of them were scared. Boyd Holt sent a representative, a young man in a blue blazer named Garrett something, with a tablet computer and a rehearsed smile, who explained in smooth, practiced language that the redevelopment was a done deal, that the ordinance had already been approved by the city council, and that residents who cooperated early would receive enhanced relocation packages. Someone asked what enhanced meant. Garrett smiled and said it meant above market value. Someone else asked who had set the market value. Garrett's smile flickered. Clover Ridge Properties uses independent appraisers. Appraisers they hire. That was Winifred from the 3rd row. She hadn't raised her hand. She hadn't stood up. She just said it, clear and level, the way you state a fact. Garrett turned toward her. Ma'am, don't ma'am me. Answer the question. Does your company select and compensate the appraisers who determine the value of the properties you're acquiring? A silence fell over the room. Garrett looked down at his tablet. Our appraisal process complies fully with yes or no. He cleared his throat. There's a process in place that ensures. So, that's a yes. Winifred nodded once, like she was confirming something she'd already known. Thank you. That's all I needed. Garrett left 20 minutes later without finishing his presentation. In the parking lot, Bet Okafor fell into step beside Winifred. You know they're not going to stop, right? That boy was just the appetizer. I know, Winifred said. So what do we do? Winifred unlocked her Buick, opened the door, and turned back for just a moment. I'm going to make a phone call tomorrow morning. To an old colleague. Who? Someone who knows exactly what that ordinance is worth. She got in the car. And what it isn't. The thing nobody in Clover Ridge knew about Winifred Hayes, the thing she had never advertised, never mentioned at church, never brought up at the PTA meetings she'd attended when Tamara was young, was that she had spent 18 years before her teaching career doing something else entirely. She had been a housing rights attorney, not a small-town family lawyer, not a generalist who drafted wills and handled the occasional property dispute. Winifred had spent the first 2 decades of her professional life working with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, specializing in discriminatory land use, municipal redevelopment law, and what the legal community calls predatory condemnation, the practice of using government authority to strip black communities of property under the guise of public improvement. She had argued cases in 7 states. She had testified before the Senate Subcommittee on Housing twice. She had, in 1998, been part of the legal team that struck down a nearly identical ordinance in Birmingham, Alabama, a case that was still cited in law school textbooks. Then Arthur got sick, and Winifred came home to Clover Ridge to take care of him, and when he passed, she just stayed, became a teacher, sang in the choir, tended her roses, and the town, seeing a quiet black woman of a certain age living a quiet life, assumed they understood everything there was to know about her. Boyd Holt, especially, had made that assumption. He was about to find out how expensive assumptions can be. He came himself on a Monday morning, which told Winifred he'd been rattled by the Friday meeting. She was in the front yard when the white Escalade rolled up, pulling weeds along the stone path, wearing her gardening gloves, an old hat against the September sun. She didn't look up when the car door opened. She kept working. Mrs. Hayes? She pulled a dandelion. Boyd Holt was a broad man, the kind who filled a doorway, and he was used to that fact, doing most of his talking for him. He walked up to the edge of her property line and stood there. Expensive shoes, pressed shirt, the careful casualness of a man who wanted to seem relaxed and wasn't. I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot, he said. With the letter, with the meeting Friday. I want you to know that's not how I prefer to operate. Winifred finally looked up. She studied him for a moment with the same expression she'd once used to look at expert witnesses who were lying on the stand. Is that right? She said. I do. Look, I understand this community has concerns. I respect that. That's why I'm here personally. I want to talk, neighbor to neighbor. You don't live here, Mr. Holt. He paused, then he smiled, the kind of smile that was meant to be charming and landed somewhere south of it. Figure of speech. What I'm saying is, I think there's a path here that works for everyone. You've got a beautiful home, you've been here a long time. We want to make sure you're taken care of. Taken care of, Winifred repeated. She pulled off one gardening glove. Then the other. You know what I find interesting, Mr. Holt? The ordinance you're using, Article 14C of the Clover Ridge Municipal Redevelopment Code, was amended in 2019. Do you know what that amendment changed? His smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes shifted. I'm sure our legal team. The amendment added a provision requiring community impact assessments for any acquisition affecting more than 15 contiguous residential properties. You're attempting to acquire 22. She folded her gloves together and tucked them in her pocket. Your notice of acquisition is procedurally invalid. It was invalid the day your employee slipped it through my door. The smile was gone now. I also want to note, Winifred continued conversationally, that 3 of the property owners on your list are over the age of 80 and received their notices in English only, despite the fact that the city's own records show they speak Vietnamese as a first language. That's a Fair Housing Act concern, a federal one. Boyd Holt stared at her. "And the appraisals," she said, tilting her head slightly, "which were performed by a firm that Clover Ridge Properties has paid over $2 million to over the past 6 years. Those are going to be very interesting reading for the Georgia Attorney General's office." She picked up her gardening gloves from her pocket and shook the dirt off them. "So." She looked at him pleasantly. "Would you still like to talk, neighbor to neighbor?" He left without another word. That afternoon, Winifred drove to the county courthouse and filed for an emergency injunction halting the acquisition on procedural grounds. She filed it herself, pro se, without a lawyer of record, because she didn't need one. The judge, a woman named Hargrove who had been on the bench for 16 years and thought she'd seen everything, read the filing in her chambers and called her clerk in. "Who is this woman?" she asked. The clerk looked at the filing. "Says she's a retired schoolteacher. Clover Ridge." Judge Hargrove looked at the motion again, 53 pages, meticulously cited with exhibits organized by tab and a table of contents so precise it made her own clerks look lazy. "A teacher," she said. "That's what it says." The judge set the filing down. "Get me the opposing counsel's contact information. I want a hearing scheduled for Thursday." The hearing was the talk of Clover Ridge. Word had spread. The way word spreads in small towns, through churches and barber shops in the parking lot of the Piggly Wiggly, that Winifred Hayes had filed something at the courthouse. Nobody knew exactly what. But Bet Okafor had told 3 people, and those 3 people had told 12, and by Wednesday evening there were people in the Maple District who felt, for the first time in 3 years, something that cautiously resembled hope. Clover Ridge Properties, LLC, showed up Thursday morning with 3 attorneys. Boyd Holt sat in the gallery in a suit that probably cost more than Winifred's monthly mortgage payment, which she had made on time every month for 22 years. Winifred showed up alone, with a single accordion folder and a yellow legal pad. The lead attorney for Clover Ridge Properties was a man named Seabrook. Precise, quick, the kind of lawyer who led with credentials and followed with aggression. He had handled municipal redevelopment cases across the Southeast for 15 years. He was very good at his job. He was also, within the first 7 minutes, visibly confused. Because Winifred was better. She argued without notes. She cited statutes by section number. When Seabrook attempted to contest her interpretation of the 2019 amendment, she produced the legislative history, the actual committee transcripts from the city council session, and submitted them as Exhibit G. When he argued that the appraisal process met state standards, she walked Judge Hargrove through a comparison of appraisal values in the Maple District versus comparable properties in the predominantly white neighborhoods 2 miles away, a gap that averaged 41%. 41%, she said, and let the number sit in the air. Judge Hargrove made a note. At one point, Seabrook leaned toward his colleague and murmured something. His colleague murmured something back. He glanced up at Winifred, just for a second, and what crossed his face wasn't contempt anymore. It was the specific expression of a man who has walked into what he thought was a one-sided fight and is now not sure how he got here. "Counsel," Judge Hargrove said, turning to Seabrook, "I'd like you to address the community impact assessment requirement directly, not your interpretation of it. The text." "Ms. Hayes has submitted the text." Seabrook straightened his jacket. "Your Honor, we believe the provision, the text," the judge said again. A pause. "The provision requires an assessment," he said finally. "And was one conducted?" "Silence. Mr. Seabrook." "No, Your Honor." Judge Hargrove closed the folder in front of her. She looked at Winifred Hayes, this small, silver-haired woman in a modest blazer, who had come in here alone with a folder and a legal pad, and in 40 minutes had methodically taken apart a 3-attorney legal team. "I'm granting the injunction," she said. The room exhaled. In the gallery, Bet Okafor pressed her hand over her mouth. Beside her, old Mr. Tran, 83 years old, who had come even though he understood maybe half of what was said, understood that completely, and reached over and squeezed her arm. Boyd Holt stared straight ahead, his jaw was set. His face was the careful blankness of a man who was already calculating his next move, already telling himself this was a setback, not a defeat. He hadn't understood yet. Winifred understood. She had been in enough courtrooms to know that some wins are won in the hearing room and finished in the parking lot, so she gathered her folder, capped her pen, and walked out through the gallery at a measured pace. No hurry, no performance. Just a woman who had done what she came to do. Holt was waiting near the door. "Don't think this is over," he said, low enough that only she could hear. Winifred looked at him with the same pleasant steadiness she'd shown in her garden 3 days ago. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I spent 18 years taking apart cases exactly like the one you built here. I have more patience than you have money." She stepped around him. "But you're welcome to find out. It wasn't over that day. These things rarely are. But over the next 4 months, it ended. Piece by piece. The way bad things end when someone is stubborn and thorough enough to see them through. The Georgia Attorney General's office opened an investigation into Clover Ridge properties appraisal practices. The City Council, facing public pressure, and a second filing from Winifred on behalf of the Maple District residents as a collective group, voted to repeal the 2019 version of Article 14C and order an independent review of the acquisition process. 2 local news stations ran stories. Then a reporter from Atlanta came down. Then a legal journal ran a piece about the case, specifically about the procedural grounds Winifred had identified, and mentioned her by name. The dean of the Georgia State University College of Law read that piece. He picked up the phone and called the number listed in the filing. When Winifred answered, he said, "Ms. Hayes, I don't know if you've considered this, but we have a housing rights clinic that could use someone with your background. We've been looking for someone to lead it for 2 years." Winifred was quiet for a moment. "I'm a retired teacher," she said. "I've read your filing," he said. "With respect, ma'am, you're not." She took the position. Part-time, she told them. She still had her choir. She still had her roses. She still had Tuesday mornings at the Piggly Wiggly and Sunday dinners with Tamara and the grandchildren, who came up from Savannah once a month. But on Wednesdays and Thursdays, she drove the 40 minutes to Atlanta, walked into the law school clinic, and sat across from families who had received manila envelopes through their doors and didn't know what to do with them. And she told them. She told them in the same level, unhurried voice she'd used in Judge Hargrove's courtroom. She told them what the language meant and what their rights were, and what the process looked like, and what to say and what not to sign. She handed them the tools they needed, one at a time, with the patience of a woman who had spent 20 years teaching 14-year-olds to understand things that didn't come easy, because that's what she was. Both things, all along. The teacher and the attorney, the quiet woman in the garden and the person who knew, word for word, the statute they were trying to use against her. She was never what they thought she was. She was always exactly who she needed to be. Now I want to ask you something. How many Winifreds are there in your town? In your family? At your church? Or at the diner you stop at on Saturday mornings? How many people have been dismissed, not once, but daily, steadily, for years, because of what someone decided they were before they opened their mouth? The thing about underestimating someone like Winifred Hayes is that you don't just lose. You lose in a way that teaches. You lose in a way that gets documented in court records and read by attorneys general and cited in law school clinics for the next 20 years. Boyd Holt eventually settled with 11 of the families who'd retained Winifred to pursue damages. The settlement terms are sealed, but the families are still in their homes. The dogwood is still in Winifred's yard. The stone path is still there. She laid it herself, 1 stone at a time. Some things, when you build them right, hold. If this story reminded you of someone you know, someone who's been underestimated, looked past, pushed around, I want you to drop their name in the comments, not the full name. Just tell me, who's the Winifred in your life? And if you believe that quiet strength is still the most powerful kind, that some people just wait until the moment is right, hit that like button, because stories like this one deserve to be heard. Subscribe to Carter Tales, share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and I'll see you in the next one.